All right, let's bring everybody back. The cookies arrived. Hopefully you all found them. We are attempting to adjust the temperature. Yes, we're working on it. It's an old building, so it's coming. All right, so we, in an attempt to keep us on time, and respect everybody else's time, we're gonna move on to our next presentation. That is a group of students that Professor Jesse O'Reilly took to the Conference of the Parties, the climate negotiations, and are going to report back on what they found, what they researched, what they reflected on, and I will let you take it away if you want to say anything more. Great. But we'll go from there.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks to these delegates for being here. Thanks to Annabelle, another COP30 delegate, for being here, and Professor Brandizio, another COP30 delegate. So we have some expertise in the room. Hopefully have some future delegates as well. And I want to thank Ostrom Workshop for supporting us in this travel course to the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm going to try to talk very little and just tee it up for these students to knock it out of the park. COP30 was held in Brazil, in Belém, in the Amazon, a city in the Amazon. We were there, the students each were there for a week. The meeting spans 2 weeks. So there were 6 students week 1, 6 students week 2. I'm going to talk about the Paris Agreement very briefly and sort of what a COP looks like, some of the key outcomes of this meeting. And then the highlight really is the report back from the students. There's Tanka, another delegate here. Please, we look forward to your questions and talking about our experience. So the first thing that happens at these COPs, and maybe what comes to mind first, if you're thinking about the big political decisions that happen at these meetings, is the functioning of the Paris Agreement. And that is sort of the top line work that the parties, that the national delegates are working on. This is sort of what the process of the Paris Agreement looks like. Each country submits a nationally determined contribution. Those are assessed all together in a global stocktake. And then parties submit new pledges that are supposed to increase ambition toward goals. This is working. So this is every 5-year cycle. If we put all of the collective pledges together, we're looking at a world that's projected to warm somewhere in the 2-degree range. Those of us who've been studying climate policy and science for a long time know that this is actually moving in the right direction. We were looking at a world warming up to 8 degrees Celsius, maybe 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, best case scenarios. So there have been some policy interventions that have helped, as well as renewable energy becoming easier and cheaper to install and run at scale, and new technologies for automobiles and things like that. So it's moving, and as anyone who works in multilateral governance knows, the international consensus is often lagging behind the scientific consensus, what's happening in other regions and parts of the world. United States, we are lagging behind the consensus at the moment. Sometimes we're not. But this is just sort of the top line story. These meetings are enormous, for better or worse, and we can talk about the implications of that, positive and negative. What did we have? 40,000 people? 50,000? About 40,000 people in attendance at the COP. There are researchers, we're Ringos, so we're researcher NGOs. And there are many universities from around the world that send delegates to these meetings, but very few of it tends to only be faculty. Very few send students, and even fewer send undergraduate students. Our delegation is a mix of undergrad and graduate students. And the reason we do that is because it's really high impact for these students, and it is also fun. There's the formal negotiations. So this might be sort of what you imagine. And these formal negotiations definitely keep many of the 40,000 people occupied. But there are many other things going on as well. So there are side events. These are academics here will recognize this is sort of a conference format with panels presenting their work and answering questions. There are pavilions, which are pretty entertaining and eclectic. There are several hundred pavilions, mostly run by countries, but also NGOs and IGOs. There's a youth pavilion, an indigenous peoples pavilion, two science pavilions this year, some business pavilions. The United States didn't have a pavilion this year. But the We Mean Business, sort of US climate business consortia, did have a pavilion there. So a lot happening there. And each of these pavilions has their own conference programming running. Civil society is also there, and this was one of the highlights of being in Brazil after the past 3 meetings being in Azerbaijan, Egypt, and United Arab Emirates, places with more limited civil society and free speech. This was very, civil society was very present inside and outside the venue. The venue is restricted, so you have to have a badge and to get into the blue zone. So there were some issues with that. We can talk about that as well. All of our IU students here are credentialed, accessing almost all of the space. Maybe they couldn't make like a couple of bilaterals that were happening in the background, but in general, everything that's open to observers is open to us. So there were protests and demonstrations inside the venue. These tend to be pretty managed by the UN. There was a big march in the streets of Belém in the intervening Saturday between the 2 weeks, which was fabulous. So some of the key outcomes that happened from this meeting, so they made progress on the Paris Agreement as usual, but what this looks like is often a set of agreements that might be multilateral, maybe some nations joined these or some decisions taken. So there was progress among the entire Conference of Parties on the just transition mechanism. This has been really controversial. Over the years, they've been trying to negotiate this, so they finally got it nailed down. And this is thinking about labor and then the transition away from fossil fuels into renewable energy to ensure that workers aren't left behind in the transition, but it's something that's livable for everyone. Adaptation goal indicators were also approved by the entire Conference of Parties. This is really interesting. So mitigation is measured through a quantitative goal, but adaptation indicators are qualitative. They decided this would be a more appropriate way to consider the diversity of adaptation actions that people, communities, countries can take. And so they agreed upon those. The COP also agreed on a gender action plan, and that was a bright light in some otherwise glum outcomes. A new round of NDCs, a lot of countries coming in late to put in their pledges, but they were due, and so I think we're going to see some more trickle in this year as well. And then a signature initiative by the Brazilian presidency was the Tropical Forest Forever Fund. This is an agreement about preservation of tropical forests, as it sounds. I think Eduardo can tell us more about that too. He was following that a bit. Maybe some of the delegates can as well. But those are just some of the headlines. But the real headline is that IU is there. So here's week 1 and week 2 in action at the meeting. They're all, it's a very competitive process to be selected. The badges are really limited. IU gets 1 or 2 badges, and the rest are me calling in favors endlessly to friends to get some more. So they're selected based on research topics. I try to select a delegation that's representative of the kinds of inquiry we do at IU really broadly. We had our first media school delegate this year. Next year for COP31, we have our first student from the School of Education. So I'm trying to collect all the schools. But generally, and you'll see this here, we have a lot of representation from HLS and O'Neill. They each pursued a different topic, and we're running around, getting lots of steps in, meeting experts, listening to presentations related to the specific area of interest in climate solutions that they were after. And it's it's very much a delegation. We share information and support each other in these cacophonous events. And so that to me is a really important part of the teaching as well. The sort of intensely collaborative and supportive environment in a really bustling sort of space. So I'm really proud of all 12 of these students. I think they had a really positive experience. And now I'm going to turn it over to them. And you can just say next, and I'll hit the slides when you're ready. So, and if you can just introduce yourselves when your slides start. Cooper, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Cooper. I'm a senior. I'm studying international law and environmental studies. And so, yeah, like Jesse said, we each had our own individual topic. My topic was the rights of nature movement. I was following the rights of nature movement at the COP, kind of beyond the COP. Just to kind of lay out what rights of nature is, if anyone hasn't heard of it, it's a philosophical and legal movement. So it's sort of a combination of the two. It's really led by and inspired by the worldviews of Indigenous people around the world. Specifically, it's caught a lot of ground in Latin America. And so that's sort of the region I focused on mostly at the COP. It looks to recognize natural entities like a river, like forests, or even animals, as having rights to exist, to regenerate. Well, there's a whole list of them. It looks to give legal personhood to natural entities, kind of changing the way they can pursue protections, they can pursue regenerative capacities. So the shift is that it moves from this human-centered, anthropocentric vision of nature towards a more living, relational, ecocentric vision of nature. And that shift is kind of what I was looking at the COP. So in Brazil, arriving in Brazil, I kind of had I had two questions that I was pursuing. The first one was that how is the movement, how is the idea of rights of nature being understood at the COP in the different spaces at the COP? Because the COP is such a huge event, like we talked about. There were so many people there and so much going on. There's also so many different voices, so many different opinions, so many different views of the climate crisis, sort of just environmental issues in general. And so I wanted to look at how rights of nature was being viewed in these particular places. And then I also wanted to see what the barriers were to a broader adoption of rights of nature, not just internationally, but locally as well. Like, what were the barriers to adoption at the local level and international level? And so, like Jesse said, I was running around the entire week. Most of my time was spent at side events and pavilion events. I didn't necessarily go into sort of the high level negotiations. I tried a couple times, but didn't necessarily get as much research information that I was looking for. So most of my time was spent on smaller side events, pavilion events across a whole variety of pavilions. and press conferences as well. But I think most of my research and most of my the richest part of my research came from conversations. I would always try to play after a side event or affiliate event, which I'm sure everyone else did here as well, and talk to people, introduce myself, introduce my research topic, but also hear from them, hear their work. So it was that was kind of one of my favorite parts of being at COP was meeting so many amazing people, so many people who had different views about the climate crisis, and approached it in different ways. And so I think I mean, you all probably can attest to, that's one of the biggest things I took back to IU with me. Next. Cool. So my overall findings about rights in nature, I was pretty surprised, because I think I came from here at IU, there's not that many people working on this topic, or even in America, there's not that many people working on this topic. And so being in somewhere where there are a ton of people who know rights in nature, but also are working on it and leading it, a lot of the movement leaders were there, representing. Had a whole, it wasn't the week that I was there, but they had a rights in nature tribunal that they do every year, and so a ton of leaders, a ton of indigenous leaders from around the world came, to talk about rights in nature, represent the movement. So I was pretty surprised about that, and also just in places that I didn't necessarily think that rights in nature would be brought up or talked about. I went to a couple events more dedicated to lawyers, even like corporate lawyers, and they were talking about rights of nature. They were bringing it up, as a climate solution, which I thought was really interesting. However, people demonstrate that there's still this large gap between knowing about the movement and then acting on it. And that's something I can get into further. And then the convergence of different movements. So I am also interested in a lot of other legal topics like ecocide recognition, well, I guess not that recent now, but in the summer, the ICJ opinion on the climate crisis, and the obligations of states. So I was kind of looking at all three movements. Those were like the two sides. If I had time, I would look at ecocide and the tribunal, or the ICJ obligation decision. And I've kind of found that they all were moving in a similar direction. It was kind of pushing the boundaries of law towards this more ecocentric notion of the law. And for me, who is studying the law and like is very interested in the law, that was a cool thing to see. And then lastly, barriers still remain. Again, this was my second question I was addressing. I would ask everyone after talking to them, what do you think the biggest barrier is to rights and nature recognition around the world, or even in your own country? And a lot of them said political and economic power, right? Who's in power? A lot of them said implementation. So there was recognition, but not necessarily the implementation that was needed. A lot of people talked about education, which I thought was really interesting. I think education is a really foundational aspect of society. And so talking about education, how we view the natural world and how our worldviews are formed around nature, was pretty interesting. And then lastly, was this embedded, more structural anthropocentrism. This is actually what I'm studying now with my undergraduate thesis, but kind of how structures of society are formed to view nature a certain way. And so when rights of nature comes in, there's this fundamental conflict between the two. So yeah, those were the barriers that I identified. Had a lot of amazing conversations with people about these particular barriers. Yeah, that was a very quick overview of my time in Brazil. Yeah, I'll pass it on to Venus to talk about hers.
So I'm Shyla. I'm a senior. I'm studying environmental management, environmental science at O'Neill, and I covered trade and kind of a changing global market at the conference. More specifically, my question was, in what ways do current global trade regimes support or undermine just climate transitions? Next. So while at the conference, I focused most of my time at the pavilions that Jesse mentioned earlier, not the formal negotiations. So I talked to a lot of NGOs, companies, and government representatives while I was at the conference. I asked specifically about trade agreements, the tariffs that were going on last spring, and the geopolitical tensions shaping climate policy. The overall trends that I noticed was that there was a growing interest in expanding global carbon trading markets, but a declining interest in trading physical materials like steel, concrete materials across long distances. People seemed really cautious about how they wanted to approach the new, I guess, geopolitical tensions arising. So I really was trying to gauge how that was affecting the trading industry. Again, these are not again, but these are more about opinions and things that I noticed, not necessarily facts, just something I picked up on. The carbon trading in general There's a momentum towards scaling this up toward a global market and less of like a central or regional market. A lot of companies were working on technical standards and talking about how to increase transparency and enforcement with a global trading market. So it was promising to see that this isn't just something that people are talking about in the academic setting, but within the industry side, people are working on developing this further and globally. And then I also kind of looked into carbon trading. So I noticed there's a lot of momentum. I looked into clean energy technologies and materials because that's largely a lot of what we trade. And there seems to be a large push towards regional or energy resource hubs. So for example, you'd source your resources within Latin America, develop those resources in Latin America, and then sell them in Latin America as well, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know how feasible that was, but it was a common thing that people talked about at multiple of the pavilions I went to. Countries want to source, develop, and trade within their own region. This could be for multiple different reasons, I think. One of them would probably be resilience to global market shifts that we are currently seeing. If you don't rely on other countries as much, I guess, for resources, then you're less resilient to different shifts within the market. Additionally, it lowers transport emissions, so you wouldn't have to transport it halfway across the globe, but it also lowered costs. And it's easier communication and oversight between the supply chain, so it would create less miscommunication and more transparency. And then I also looked at supply chain and transportations because that's also a part of trade. Trade depends on transportation. And the sector has barely decarbonized. It's still responsible for 20% of global emissions, roughly. And it's a major issue, and I think one of the major issues that creates a lot of barriers within the supply chain is communication and poor visibility. So many companies, especially at the higher ups, don't know where or how their resources are being sourced, which is a huge issue that leads to sustainability and human rights issues, especially within the extractivism fields. So there are a lot of consulting firms that talked about how they wanted to address these issues. Again, I thought it was promising that at least people were talking about the issue at the conference and trying to find ways and solutions to addressing these. Lastly, I looked at trade policy more generally, international trade policy. One of them that was talked a lot at the conference was the CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism proposed by the European Union. It's a bill that taxes carbon intensive goods from various countries, and it was widely criticized by a lot of different countries, specifically lower income countries, because they don't have usually the income to pay this tax. It was also widely contested by EU farmers because fertilizers was one of the lists of things that were taxed, and farmers obviously can't produce a bunch of crops if they don't have fertilizers, especially with the changing climate that we are currently seeing. It was just put into place in 2026, so we'll see how that actually plays out. I think generally this is like a good idea, but the execution is a little messy. And then the next slide. So I think by far though, the conference, these are some of the pictures of the events and the things that were going on at the conference. And one of the delegates made a conference. This was probably one of my best life experiences, I think. Even with the humidity, flooding, and the fires that were happening. Every delegate spent roughly 12 hours at the conference learning and talking to different people within their field of interest. And then we spent another several hours, sometimes up until 2 o'clock in the morning, just debriefing what we had learned and talking about ways that we can address these issues. And I felt that was really insightful to just kind of see everyone's viewpoints and how we were trying to tackle the same issue, but from different perspectives. I thought that was really amazing to see. It's promising to see all these moving parts in one place and so many different people dedicating their lives to fixing this issue. I really could see how climate mitigation is something that everyone could implement, even on the local scale or personal scale, within this international market or international climate negotiation. So yeah.
That was 12 hours a day, right?
Yes, every day.
Hold the hours. I always wonder if they're gonna like peel out and go enjoy the town, and they do, but not until the entire meeting has gone to bed. That's
one picture of that Sunday we spent on the Amazon, and we looked at like a cacao farm I believe, and that's that top corner, which was really nice.
Right, Marie.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Marie Renahan. I'm a Master of Environmental Sustainability student at O'Neill, part-time. And while I was at COP30, I studied the inclusion of disabilities at the event and in climate action internationally as a whole. Disabled people make up about 15% of the global population, and they're estimated to be as much as 4 times more likely to die in a climate natural disaster than non-disabled people. So they're highly vulnerable, but they haven't been recognized on nearly the same scale as women, children, and Indigenous peoples who all have had formal constituency recognition by the UNFCCC, this governing body over the COP events and over the Paris Agreement. So I followed the Disability Caucus. This is a group of now over 125 organizations that are calling for this formal recognition, and they are advancing climate action that is inclusive of people with disabilities. You can go to the next one. And another one too. So I carried out a series of interviews with Disability Caucus members, really trying to get to the barriers that they faced, whether it was a structural problem, just a baseline access problem with getting into the venue spaces, governance, anything that prevented them from engaging on the same level as their peers at these events. I also had the opportunity of attending many meetings that the caucus arranged with other delegates, and this was one of the best experiences I had at COP. So this picture is with Gillian Martin. She's in the middle. She is the Secretary of Climate and Energy for Scotland. So she's actually relatively high power in this space. And the Disability Caucus used this opportunity to advocate for inclusion and talk about all the issues that face them in the climate space. And it was incredibly inspiring to be part of that conversation and see it happening and see the progress happening just in the span of 15 minutes in this negotiation. Go to the next one. There was some progress at COP30, so 3 different documents were released at the end of the event that included the term disability or disabled people. I know that sounds very surface level, of course it is, but it is huge progress. This coming from a place where disabled people are often not recognized within their own countries, this is a step in the right direction. And then since COP30 in February of this year, the Disability Caucus was formally recognized by the UNFCCC, not as a constituency, but as an informal group. Hopefully that will be a stepping stone in the right direction toward constituency recognition. When they get to that constituency level, a lot of doors will open in terms of funding opportunities, negotiations they'd be able to attend. So this really is a progress point, but there's still a lot of work to be done. The caucus members had a lot to share on gaps and calls to action that they had for countries, for representatives, anyone who was at the event. One of the biggest gaps is still, of course, limited support from the UNFCCC, but also the host country itself. They have a huge role to play in making sure the venue is actually accessible, that people using wheelchairs can get into the venue and use the transit options available, that translators and interpreters are on site, and that those services continue throughout the weeks. This event was better in many ways than previous years, where there have been stories of people using wheelchairs who couldn't physically enter COP venues because they weren't wheelchair accessible. So it's a grand improvement from that, but there's still a long way to go. Nothing about us without us. That is a hallmark phrase of the disability movement. And it's true for climate action as well. This is one of the major calls that anything that affects disabled people should have disabled people's voices embedded in the planning process and in the implementation process. And that includes 15 for 15 on a financial side, that 15% of a budget for a climate project should be allocated for the 15% of the population that is disabled. So it's more of a financial inclusion, putting your money where your mouth is, beyond just a social inclusion and a representation aspect. And then countries still have a lot of work to do. About 72% of countries are not including disability in their nationally determined contributions, their climate goals. So individual countries still have a lot of progress that they need to make. You can go to the next one. And then I had some great opportunities to connect with caucus members, and I'll end with a couple quotes from them. So Jenny Chinchilla, she said that disability inclusion and climate governance is achievable when there is political will. She said this very optimistically, that as disabled people, as a caucus, we have the power to influence policy and get to the climate action that we want that's inclusive. On the other side, Deepika Lama, she said, why would I go to the climate negotiations when I'm not heard? So I think this is pointing to that even once there is constituency recognition, there is still a big role that countries in power and negotiators with power have to play in opening space and actually allocating resources for the things that disabled people call for, not just listening to them on a surface level. So still a lot of work to be done, but overall I loved my experience at COP. There was a lot of progress made there.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Venus, and I'm from Mongolia. So my research topic was sustainable land use in Mongolia, especially the policy interventions, because I study Master of Public Affairs and policy student. So and I'm a graduate student. So here today, next, please, yeah. I will not talk more about my research. I would rather talk about what I observed at COP30 and especially regarding the land issues. So to start with, just give a background. So almost 40% of world's land is under threat of desertification, and but we still have an opportunity to restore the land. So we have to see the land as an opportunity for restoration rather than just accepting its degradation. So in 1992, since 1992, there has been 30 years, and it was a good occasion that this COP took place in Brazil, because the first COP took in after the Rio summits in 1992. So the Rio summits, just also give background, created three major conventions. One is the UN Framework for Climate Change, Convention on Climate Change. The other one is Convention on Biodiversity, Biological Diversity. And third one is UN Convention to Combat Desertification. So the Climate Convention takes every year, and then the other two conventions meeting takes place every 2 years. So my question was actually, especially at this COP of the climate change, to look at how land issues are visible in this COP. So when I arrived at the COP, I mostly arranged my time with visiting all the events related to land, and then attend the dialogues and discussions related to land issues. So next, please. So it was a good opportunity to realize that, especially at this COP, according to my observation, the land issues became more visible among all three conventions. And then if you look at the picture 3, there are three executives of the three conventions. Simon and the other two people, I don't remember their name there, they came together for a discussion, and then they talked about it's time to come together rather than having separate discussions, and then looking at the issue of climate change, desertification, as well as biodiversity as a silo issues. So it was a good opportunity to observe that finally all the conventions are trying to come together, especially they are trying to look at the issues as a whole on Earth rather than different silo issues. So here on the second picture, I attended different discussions and dialogues. So this is an example of discussion that civil society and NGOs from West Africa came together with the GCF, the big funders of the climate issues, and they were also sharing their issues that funding is one of the main issues in combating the land degradation. So on the picture 1, this is a discussion of a Singaporean pavilion. So Singapore is leading, especially in carbon market policies. And I attended many discussions at the Singaporean pavilion, because for Mongolia, it was a good example to look at what they are doing and also seek for further cooperation. So next, please. So I will just briefly mention what kind of achievements were at the COP related to land, and then so three main achievements I would mention here is Brazil launched the TFFF, Tropical Forests Forever Fund. So they raised 5.5 million at the launch, and 53 countries came together. And also second, land and agriculture related. This is an old initiative, but it was renewed again. And then the funding for land and agriculture issues, again, they increased their funding requirements that we still need more funding. So, and then third one is resilient agriculture investment for net zero land degradation. It's an initiative by also at the COP, so they will be more, they will be also paying attention more, mobilizing funding from the private sector for the land issues. So lastly, so I just wanted to share this report as an information for everyone who is interested in land issues. So the report is about a global stocktake analysis. The University of Melbourne, I think it's from the University of Melbourne, they analyzed all the NDCs, nationally determined contributions from the countries, and found what kind of gaps are there, so that countries are kind of over-promising in terms of land carbon sink, and then it's impossible. So yeah, if anybody is interested, can have a look at the land report. So thank you so much.
Great. So we will do questions. This is COP 31 happening in November in Antalya, Turkey. And I know you can see from these outstanding presentations that these students were incredibly engaged in participant observation or event ethnography at the COP to understand how communities within the UNFCCC are working on particular issues. I learned a lot from them, and I know they're going to do incredible things with their research and in their careers. And we are happy to take questions.
I have a question. I'm from Belém. How was to navigate the city? So I know that we want to focus on maybe we have questions, but how was to be in Belém? How was to enjoy? I saw a picture of a kumbu, like other the side, so we could enjoy the cacao, like the cacao farm. But how was to navigate the city? Because I know that the climate change we can feel there, right? It's too hot, it's too humid. The rain was crazy because it was November, December is the raining season. So how was to navigate and to do your research and to be like these 12 hours in that pavilions, that the food also was a problem. I was following everything. So yeah, just your experience there.
So I guess I loved it. It was such a, like people said, it was one of the best experiences of my life, but probably one of the best experiences here at IU as a student. I think navigating the city, it was really interesting because it's almost like when a city hosts the Olympics or something, this huge event, they set up infrastructure for that event. And so it was, I think we kept having to remind ourselves, like, this is a different city than if you went without COP. And I think that was important. Like, there was specific buses to pick up delegates that wouldn't have necessarily been there before. And so that was interesting. But I mean, the city itself was really wonderful. We got out. We got chances to go out kind of after, see really cool areas of the city. We also went to Kombu. We kind of copied them and went to Kombu. But yeah, for me, it was a really it was an adventure. Obviously, it was somewhere I've never been before. And we kind of cheated because we had a delegate, Bernardo, who's Brazilian. He's from Sao Paulo, but he's Brazilian, so he speaks Portuguese. So that he was a kind of guide in terms of like navigating language, but also like cultural barriers in Brazil. But yeah, if you guys want to talk about.
I mean, I'll go ahead and add on to that. The people were intense, but they were beyond welcoming. I would just walk through the conference or like through the streets and people would walk up to me and like start like hugging me and be like, oh, like welcome. And like they were just like excited that we were like here. And I was like, I don't know who you are, but they were so sweet. And everyone was more than willing to talk to us. I think we went to like the grocery store that was around the street, and that was like a fun experience too, because it's run very differently than American grocery stores. But it was it was very different from our culture. Like I think Brazil is far enough away to be different from American culture, but it was a good experience, I think, to step outside of American culture and see how they operate, I guess, within Belém in Brazil. I think it was very insightful. So, yeah.
I don't think we had food problems either compared to some of the other years.
Yeah.
We all, I think, discovered this buffet that was like local farmers. It was like the local food buffet, and it was inexpensive. It was so good and interesting, and yeah, people were really excited to like lots of Uber conversations on Google Translate. It's very welcoming.
Yeah, thank you so much. Amazing presentations. I have a question for the panel generally, and then I have a question for Jesse. So for the panel, like I was kind of stuck by one of your comments, and like, you know, I had amazing time despite what was happening in the world, right? So it's that particular place in that particular moment where like these larger processes and your individual lives kind of come face to face, right? And as a scholar, as an activist, or as a, you know, as an individual, as a citizen of the world, like you see these processes happening. How did you come out of these processes? Like, did you think that there's like much less happening? We were all gonna die sometime soon, or like, oh my God, yes, at least something is happening, so we're heading in the right direction. So, what were your experiences in terms of like, are we doing enough as people in the world or not? And my question to Jesse is that like, you've been doing this for some time now, right? Like, so how does it kind of contribute to your own sort of like research agenda, as well as like what do you as a person get out of it?
Great. First.
Oh, you can go, Shadi.
I think I came out of it very overwhelmed because it's just 12 hours and then some more hours on top of that once we get back to the apartment of just talking about all of these issues, and no one seems to have like a concrete solution to these issues. So I think the first like month after the conference, I was just kind of trying to grapple with the idea that there's all these higher up people that don't have this like concrete solutions to these issues. But I think the further away I get from the conference, the more I realize that maybe like this isn't something that we can't solve overnight. So we need to like have all these different opinions and like have people try and pull these different levers to fix this big issue that we're trying to tackle. So I think now that I'm further away from the conference and have had time to kind of debrief and like process everything that happened, I feel like I came out of it very optimistic now. Just because I'd rather have someone work on a solution than not work on a solution at all, I think.
Yeah. I can just quickly go. I think I actually came out hopeful, I think as well. For me, that hope kind of came from seeing so many people come together and work on a certain issue or on the climate crisis. In the areas that I was in for my research specifically, I think really contributes to that. Like everyone was pushing the boundaries of like action. And most of them were activists themselves or in some capacity. And so, yeah, I became hopeful because it's this huge conference of everyone coming together, working on the same issue. Kind of, I don't know, it makes you realize that there are so many communities out there working towards a better world, and it's inspired me to pursue the career. Well, I was already going down this career, I think, in general, but to push me further Is that correct?
So as I mentioned, it was good to see the three convention leaders coming together and looking at the issue as a whole. And also the other thing I realized is the developing countries, especially the negotiators, needs more support and they need more because yeah, still they are I think like how to say it, their capacity is not at the level of pushing their issues towards the advanced countries. So, but I think things are getting evolving and being visible and heard, but still there are like need for support and capacity building for countries. Yeah.
Yeah, I think overall I had a very positive experience and I did leave mostly optimistic. I think there's still a lot of structural barriers. The kind of multi-levels of governance in this space is really challenging to navigate. I didn't see a lot of crossover between, negotiators going to pavilions and vice versa. So a lot of the conversations I was having with caucus members and with other pavilions, they had many calls to action. They had a lot they wanted to get done, but they were having trouble accessing the negotiations to actually call for that on an international scale. So I think that's still something that needs to keep progressing and hopefully more cross-sector integration in the future. But overall, I think it's a good event and an important one to keep holding.
Yeah, I'm pursuing my own research while I'm there as well. I study science and scientists and how they contribute to environmental decision making. And so I've been following the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change around since 2008. And I've started attending these meetings in 2015, where the Paris Agreement was signed in. First of all, I'm like forever chasing that feeling. That was like the one day that climate action felt really, really optimistic. And so I'm still chasing that high. But second of all, there are a lot of scientists there. I follow one of the negotiating streams, research and systematic observation, which is getting increasingly obstructed by some negotiators who want to look like they don't want to look explicitly political, so they're finding like new ways to deny climate or to block or obstruct action by these seemingly neutral technological conversations in RSO and research and systematic observation. So this is a lot of I watch negotiations. I have meetings and interviews with IPCC authors and leaders, and then I've been doing Antarctic work for a really long time. So there's always some Antarctica stuff going on too.
How does having students around help or hinder that your own research?
So it's not the central node of my research. And I don't think I would go actually if I wasn't taking students at this point. I know what this meeting looks like. However, the only thing that gets me close to the happy feeling, or actually maybe even happier than the day we finally got to the Paris Agreement, was seeing these students striding around, talking to world leaders and experts, and like they jump so quickly and enthusiastically with all their idealism into making the most of this experience and learning as much as they can so that they can make a positive impact in their future careers. And so if anything, it inspires me to be energetic, and I can always extract information from IPCC people on Zoom if needed.
Mostly it's love's labor.
Huh?
Mostly it's love's labor then.
Yeah.
I would just quickly add on that I did my research in Mongolia's pastureland management, and then I produced a white paper, especially directed at the government of Mongolia. And this year, the COP17, which is the COP against combating desertification, is taking place in Mongolia. So at the moment I'm in the process of publishing my paper. I mean, not in the journal, but on social media as well as on local sites in Mongolia. So I would say like that. That's the result of, I think, bringing the students and then, yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, I have a question regarding that COP bill. What was the main, discourse that you noticed there? Did countries were more supportive of climate adaptation or climate mitigation? You know, because climate mitigation and climate adaptation are two different things politically. I mean, if they wanted to, I don't know, mitigate climate change issues, it's against the development, you know, and there might be high tension between countries regarding development issues. And if they want to, I don't know, stick to climate adaptation, it's a dream basically, because it's long term and it might not come true. I mean, I was wondering what was the main discourse there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of texture to this debate, but the main discourse is we need to do everything all at once as fast as we can and as ambitiously as possible. So there are folks working on all of it at once. And on the high level policy, I would say mitigation is dominant. But adaptation is an article in the Paris Agreement. Loss and damage is also its own article in the Paris Agreement with a new funding facility for that. So that's sort of going beyond adaptation even. And so, yeah, there are different things that enable movement in these different areas based on political will and resources and that sort of thing. But I would say the general trend is do every single thing you can at the biggest scale you can.
And how countries respond to this? Do they all agree with climate mitigation?
Yes. They say they do. They say they do. Some want it to go, like Saudi Arabia wants it to go much more slowly. They want time to adjust their economy. They call it a just transition. And it is. And so there's debate about how to do it, not that we need to do it. There's agreement that climate change is real, caused by humans happening. We need to solve it. And then there's texture to the debate on how to do that, how fast to do that, who's responsible, where's the money coming from, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Yes.
I can go for it. Always necessary.
So, thank you. Great to see you again. Really, I have one question for each, like about the different projects. Cooper, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the different perspectives to right of nature that you found, something that was surprising and people approaching the same thing from, very different angles. Then in the case of lands, I wonder what's your impression of the big agribusiness lobby there, because they invested a lot there and they probably shaped the outcomes of the agenda. So I wonder if you have anything about the agribusiness. Then in your case, I'm curious whether, did you to approach like business corporate sectors? How was access to it? Did you have was it difficult to have more access, corporate leaders and so forth? So I was curious about that. For my heroes thinking, is this caucus also operating at the biodiversity COPs? Because I don't remember seeing them there, and I would imagine that, like access to green space and other things would be important. So I was curious whether they are operating in multiple COPs.
Just with an eye on time, if you could keep it really brief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For questions.
Very briefly, the different perspectives. I think some people were really pushing towards Western nature as a climate solution. Some people were supportive of the idea of rights, like moving towards a more ecocentric perspective, but they weren't necessarily involved with the rights of nature. They kind of figured out, well, nature should already have rights. So there was some discourse there, and then people who had heard of it but didn't really think it necessarily where it could go further. So I guess those were the main three kind of grappling.
I will also quickly answer to that. So specifically, I didn't look at the lobby side of the agribusiness at this stage, but I would just say, according to my observations, when it comes to least developed and developing countries, as who has issues, especially related to agriculture, they still need to stand high against those lobbies, or should be able to counterattack any lobby who is going against, to their sake. So I would say there are still a lot to be done, especially for the least and developing countries in terms of raising their voices.
I think as far as access goes, when I would talk to different like corporations or private industries, they would give like a very generic answer when I'd ask about sustainability and clean energy technology, and not like a straightforward like step-by-step process on how they want to solve things. I think I had more success talking to nonprofits just because that's what their whole mission was focused on. It wasn't on making a profit. So
For the question about the biodiversity COP, I haven't heard of much overlap there and not a lot of attendance as far as I'm aware. I think as the caucus grows, there's going to be more involvement in different dimensions under the UNFCCC. I know there will be some representation at Bonn this summer, but there's still a lot of barriers for, cost of attendance for disabled people. We have a lot of extra needs just to attend events. So I think that's going to be a longer term problem. Yeah.
One more question, we'll answer quickly. Oh, or do we? Okay.
Really, really, really quickly, because we really want to make sure we have time for folks to walk around and take a break before then.
Yes, please.
Really quickly.
Okay, really quickly. I was going to ask two questions. First of all, thank you so much. It's nice to hear firsthand experiences. My question, what specifically the youth group, to what extent is the youth's role in climate specific adaptation policy visible at the COP 30? Because this is important for 31st and will be held in Antalya. This is the question.
I can briefly say that I think the youth have a huge role in climate policy, in especially international climate policy. I've done a lot of studies of like a research on like climate law and climate change law, and I know there's a huge movement of youth plaintiffs as bringing these cases to courts. And
how do they describe the youth? Which youth? Because youth not just only in academia. Just wonder,
in general. Yeah, I think youth in general, like a lot of them are students just because a lot of them are studying these roles and things like that. But I think at this COP in particular, there was a lot of indigenous youth as well there. So that was a huge thing that might not be at other COPs, but it was in Belém.
Add really quickly too, there were some influencers there, which we all thought was interesting, who were 16 and up. So they're present and like their stance.
We have a constituency, the Youngo, so there's a lot of young.
One surprise I saw was China brought their secondary or high school students to the COP, and those students were very, very impressive. So that was very interesting to see how such an authoritarian country brings their youth voices to these global negotiations.
You guys did a great job. I'm sure that this is a super. I'll come back at 5 after.
Yeah.
Great job.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Love hearing about it. And nice hearing about it a few months after, like it books a little more. I'll be there. Elected both. What were you doing? Yeah, it's gonna
That was so close.
Email so that we can connect and meet the delegation and give us some.
I'm gonna take some chairs in for you.
But we.
Yes, but like.
Yeah. Hi.
I'll try. But.
We're established observers. Yeah.
And after all.
Send me an email. I'm about to travel for the summer, but in the month I'd love to.
I'm working.
The road side.
Yes, sir.
Is that like a reason?
Yes. That's why the energy company has to.
Yeah, the budget's.
Yeah.
Right, I don't know.
Congratulations on this.
I've heard it's beautiful. Oh, cool.
Soon as the
Oh, thank you.
You should have.
You wanna move up here?
The best.
How are you?
So if they're gonna be presenting some things here, you want them to sit on the corner to here, we'll take over.
Confident and able to talk about.
Oh, see, it does look awkward.
As I go along.
Dad's got a question.
Over to this side, and then you can, that way you're not trying to look over your shoulders. So we're a couple hours in. Oh, see, and
Yeah, we took.
pretty, that's free.
How are you?
That looks fun.
Great to see you. Yeah.
Nice day to do.
I was worried about.
Oh my gosh, yeah, thank you for coming. No, it's so nice to see delegates. Always trying to get a variety of people.
You.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, thank you so much for coming in.
Am I saying it right?
Yeah, it's like, I used to say rolling because like.
Well.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah.
Can you go like, can you go like?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, thank you. You guys did great.
Bro, why you locked in the slides, bro?
I've been paying these slides. Oh, yeah? Various roles.
You didn't even look at it.
Why you locked this? I couldn't find like the O'Neill.
I spent.
I spent 2 minutes.
They were too expensive.
Semester.
This got locked in.
Really?
Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about kind of the, project and
Yes, please.
say, we'll kind of query the room about their views and these things. You guys could talk about what you actually found.
Gosh, you committed this.
Yeah. I mean, usually it's in 35 minutes. Yeah, that's all.
It's like it's hard, but it's.
Some of the people that presented earlier didn't actually present finding so much as a process. And in this case, like.
Get a full ride.
It's a big part. Like,
Oh, pretty much fine.
Right. Less housing, guys.
so do you guys have preference on yours first?
Yeah, you look pretty locked in.
Engineering, but he has this like business stream that I keep trying to quash, but it's not like quash.
Is there gonna be
like some of his,
where I see and like?
he goes between.
Searching through the archives. Yeah, so would do like a 5 to minute
You're not
go through it. Oh, no.
You're an attorney.
You don't need to go, I'm not grading you guys here on all this.
Whatever.
Oh, you didn't mention this one part.
Exactly.
So that kind of,
No, sometimes that's the way.
how do we transition from these vague ideas?
There's no shame
To
getting.
actually find the information, we can give it information and we can do this.
I would love that. You said you're the.
Swear to God, I'm like, what is the Twilight Zone?
And if I forget.
There's coffee. Well. That was it. Well, I realized it was a little late. So we took- there you go.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, I would have to.
It was shocking. So I was like,
Maybe, I think it's the idea.
Awesome.
You wanna get another?
Okay.
Cooking.
She had her cop for your, their experience.
I was like, I'm just gonna.
Okay, cool. I want to be your client.
Right here. It was,
Oh, really?
You, bye guys.
Oh, wow.
Different group thing.
Different group.
Different group.
A cool group though. Oh, Pop 31.
Barriers.
Yeah.
Um,
And then Lewis is gonna apply for COP too, right?
Kind of,
Wait,
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah.
In the process is.
Like sub-Saharan?
First,
Something that.
the one in Durban might have had a side meeting. Are you gonna be a grad student?
I'm gonna be a grad student
Are you?
There's monthly.
at Duke.
Amazing. Congratulations.
And a cop delegation.
You should come.
Oh,
What are you doing at Duke?
Activities that we have.
my
It's a.
concentration is gonna be community engagement, and environmental justice, and they've got some of their own trip-based next to like Mexico to, so I might now
jobs pretty.
look at one of those.
How they doing it like?
You should come to the Congratulations.
Thank you.
PhD or master's program?
Especially like nesting.
Yeah. Agreement with like. Large part of it's trying to just kind of delay getting a job. Like I want to develop expertise for like 2 years.
Wait till the jobs come back. Internationally.
And I'm open to that.
Yeah. There's a lot of options if you're willing to hustle.
Eventually.
I'm not gonna take them seriously on the 5 after. Yeah.
Jacob's like told our class a little about this.
We're just talking about SR land food security. That's what.
And share with you, they've been.
I always feel like I should be a vegetarian after I hear this.
Literally.
Or think about it for like.
You'll have your choices at least of beef or chicken. Those are the 2 things that happen.
You're saying.
Yeah.
All right, ready?
Yeah.
Part 3. Thanks everybody for sticking around. There appear to be several cookies left. So this next group has been doing this this sort of really interesting project through Dr. Eldon's class on developing consumer sustainability reports. I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit more about what is entailed in this. But this is one of those really fascinating, sort of really applied kinds of projects that I think are really, really exciting. That here at the Ostrom workshop, I think we're really kind of excited to engage. I'm going to turn it over to you and go for it.
Okay, so my name's John Eldon. I teach environmental science and sustainability class on O'Neill, which puts me in kind of the funny situation of teaching things that I never took because 25 years ago, there weren't sustainability classes, or if there were, they were pretty kind of vague and hand wavy and not a lot of substance to them. Now, sustainability assessment, which is where this came from, is like an industry and a career, and it's something much more coherent, but at the same time, it's changing very quickly. So in teaching this class, I kind of avoid a bit of an outsider perspective, and at the same time wanted to make sure we kept the skills training and the concepts and all that very grounded in basically not academia. Didn't want to just be a bunch of definitions and academic discussion because people are trying to go get jobs. It's primarily a graduate class. We had 3 undergrads, 2 of them are here today. So they're working with people who are trying to go get jobs in the sustainability industry for the most part. The other thing that kind of struck me in designing this class was that it's really nice to be able to go to a job interview and put something on the desk that is not like a 50-page thesis. Nobody wants that. So having something where you're like, oh yeah, I made this, here, take a look, is a really, I think, valuable thing. So with that in the back of my mind, just think about what this class would look like. We started last year for the first time. And it struck me that as consumers, many of us have interest in sustainability and we don't really have good information. So if you go to buy a car, you can, read the EPA report about miles per gallon and read reviews about durability, and you can read a consumer report about, rankings and different things. And that's great for many things, but those are largely about price, about durability, about, efficiency, things like that. A lot of consumers are now interested in questions of sustainability. Take kind of the blood diamonds concept and apply it to everything. Like, what's the greenhouse gases impact of this? What's this? And what are my options? And as a consumer, how do I pick the best thing beyond the taste and the price and the kind of immediate impact and the health implications? Like, how do I think beyond that? And for reasons that I don't really have a good answer to, that information is not currently available. So I thought, oh, why don't we do that as a class? Why don't we make these consumer reports about sustainability, or consumer sustainability reports is my creative thinking about what we could call them. And turns out it's both, I think, a good class assignment and a good potential output that you can put on your resume and push across the job interview desk. It's also kind of hard. And so we're presenting on, this is our second round of trying this. First round with good support from Ostrom. So Mackenzie here, so the 2 undergrads, Wang and Jacob, and then Mackenzie's a TA. She's been supported by Ostrom to help me figure out what we're doing, get a second pair of eyes on it. And then the goal is, again, through Ostrom, to get these into a format where we can make a nice glossy PDF that you can push across the table, like something a little more formal, because I think people want to know. So just to give one example, I'm guessing most of you in here have at some point bought a chocolate bar, I would guess. If you haven't, that's fine. Not judging, and if you go to the supermarket and you're looking at the aisle of chocolate bars, there's like 50, 60, 100 options. And a lot of people, I think, know about deforestation and child labor and water use, greenhouse gases, land use change, all that other stuff. But as a consumer, you're faced with like 50, 100 options. And me, I go with the one that has a picture of the orangutan on it because it's called endangered species chocolate. I mean, does it get better than that? Yeah, well, maybe. It probably does actually get better than that. And you've got like a 99 cents for a Hershey bar. You've got $8 for something expensive. I think it goes up to like $400 for a bar. There's gold leaf one you can buy if you want to. I don't go to that supermarket. You can find those. And there's just really very little information. Some of them will have a picture of a farmer on the back. That makes you feel good too. Orangutan on the front, farmer on the back. What more do you want? Some of them are organic. Some of them are fair trade. Some of them are 1% for the planet. Things. And most of that stuff is kind of meaningless, but it's reflecting the fact that consumers are interested and that there's a big market to be had by, like, people will pay 8 times as much if you have some nice recyclable wrapping with a picture of some farmers on it. Like, there's a huge market, there's a huge demand, and right now there's not really the available information. So we're trying to correct that for everyone because no one else is, I guess, kind of. Again, turns out it's hard. So today we have presentations on the beef industry and chicken. The idea being, most of the time you don't see 50 types of chicken, but there's often a variety. And as a consumer, you go to the grocery store, do you get the Tyson chicken? Do you get the local whatever, right? And so there's a range of things. And the idea is, how do we get the information together to help people make better decisions? They could just not eat chicken. That would solve the problem from a chicken perspective. But if you're going to eat it, how do you make better decisions? Make sustainability informed, make decisions informed by sustainability considerations. So that's the question. I thought we might start as we'll do beef and then chicken with kind of maybe a quick run around the room of one, what do you think is relevant? And two, how do you make decisions based on that? So what sort of things do you see as consumer and what do you do about it? So just maybe let's start with beef. Assuming you eat beef, and again, if you don't, that's great, but then we can look at soy and do the same thing. We can look at, tofu brands or whatever, right? What do you think is relevant for beef in terms of like trying to have a lower footprint, a lower kind of sustainability impact? What do you think is relevant, and what do you see as the options that are presented to you when you're buying beef? Ruling out, so kind of scope statement, ruling out the pink slime. Do you guys remember that? Be aging myself here. The like highly processed stuff. Just if you're going for cuts of beef, what do you have to work with if you're trying to make a better decision? Location. So are you buying Indiana local beef? Are you buying like labeled beef? Great. Yes.
I like to think about if they've gotten to be a cow or a beef cattle before they died.
Happy beef?
That's it. Yep.
It's grass fed.
What's that? Grass fed.
Grass fed.
Yep. And so that's often sometimes a label. And the location, sometimes you can see there's labeling rules, but there's also a bunch of loopholes about those, as I understand. So we have location, we have kind of something about how it was raised, kind of maybe
Range, maybe.
yeah, free range, grass fed.
How it died.
How it died. Nail gun versus sorry. Somehow we end up with the meats here. We have a beer group and a wine group and a coffee group, but we're here to talk about carcasses. Meat packing. What else might you want to know beyond what's available to you?
Antibiotics.
Antibiotic use, yeah, sure.
And use change consequences.
Yep. Is this a Brazilian rainforest turned into beef, turned into burger in Indiana where we already have grass and beef?
Slave labor.
Labor issues along the way? Absolutely. Most of that information is not yet available. And we have just a few things. And I think there's growing understanding of like methane emissions along the way and pollution and land use change. And we're not yet, I say yet tentatively, at a place where as a consumer you can make a decision on that. We're trying to push the industry along. Why don't we start with beef? You can walk us through kind of what you found. We can have some discussion about that. Maybe we'll then switch to chicken, do the same thing. And then we can step back and think about research and the like.
Yeah, so my name is Jacob. Professor Eldon briefly introduced me. I'm a senior over at O'Neill doing environmental management. A couple pieces of context for this. So I put together these slides, but I have two other teammates, Taylor and Rochelle, who helped put together a lot of the content. And then in terms of scope, we scoped out to an extent international beef. We kind of kept this domestic. We also scoped out some animal welfare things just because that opens up a whole separate dimension. But in there a little bit and things like organic certifications, but we scoped that out. And the last piece of context is that when I got to college, I actually decided to stop eating beef. So I haven't eaten beef in 4 years, and that was, I can't tell you why I did that, other than a broad, like, it's better for the environment. So this is really interesting to do. So the industry itself is quite interesting. So the top left graph here is the beef industry employment. So these are people like cattle hands, ranch hands, etc. Really, really declining, but still employing almost 1 million people a year in the United States. We got another 500,000 people in meatpacking. So this is still a cornerstone of the American economy. But that employment drop really mirrors a drop in consumption as well. So beef has become less a part of the American diet. It's still a big part of it, but it's been steadily declining for a lot of reasons. Price, which is fueled by domestic policy and tariffs and sanctions and all the like. But also just diet changing. More people are becoming aware of the environmental and labor and et cetera concerns associated with beef. And then at the bottom here, I listed the 4 companies who control about 90% of the meatpacking industry. So this is a very consolidated industry, which can make it hard if consumers want to feel like they have choice. So 90% of all of the beef comes from those 4 companies. You really have to work pretty hard to find the beef that's the 10%. And then we mentioned some of these on the right. These are just some of the things you might see in the grocery store. So there's indications of meat quality. So the USDA grades, certified Angus beef. We largely didn't worry about those because those are functions of other decisions like how you fed the cow, how you raised the cow, etc. And then indications of feed, so grain-fed, grass-fed. There's some variation within those, but broadly those are the two big ones, grain-fed being the conventional method. And then organic, non-GMO, non-antibiotics, ever, etc. And then the last one we mentioned, product of USA is actually a USDA labeling, the certification that you can get put on your beef. We can talk more about that later if you're interested, and then international versus local. So these are kind of the main things. The things in red are the ones we really focused on as the different levers a consumer could pull. We then went into the product life cycle, which, I think in our report that we're writing, we have a sentence that's like, a lot has been said about farm to table. Beef production begins on a different farm than a lot of people realize, and that's the cornfield. So about 40% of all global agricultural land is used to grow, some estimates even have that higher, feed for livestock. So we're spending a lot of our land and resources and environmental quality to grow feed for livestock. In America, this lies in the Corn Belt, so heartland, basically like Plains to Ohio is where we're growing all that corn. You all know that. You are here in Indiana. But then that moves to the production phase, like the on-farm production. Before this, I did not really know that there was 3 different stages to this. So there's cow-calf operations, which basically their whole job is to just breed cows, make calves. And then a lot of times they're sold to something called a backgrounding operation, which is larger herd, larger land. It's just pasture where they're growing until they get sold to the feedlot. So almost all cows in America do have time on pasture. They stay there for about a year before they move to the feedlot for the finishing phase of 4 to 6 months, where they're fed a really high energy diet. This is the CAFOs that you see in the news all the time if you read environmental news. And then the last 3 steps here are, so like I said, the meatpacking industry is very concentrated. It's still very labor intensive. We'll talk about this more later too, but really high risk of injury in the meatpacking industry, and also really high use of immigrant labor, which means that high risk of injury, federal protection for workers' compensation, et cetera, can create really tough working conditions. And then transportation, it's stage 4 here, but really it's between every single stage of this whole thing. There's just no nice place to put that. So it's stage 4. And then stage 5 is disposal. So this is another big part that like 6% or 6 to 10% of all global emissions come from food waste. So it's like we're getting all of the negative consequences of the inputs and impacts from the beginning and not getting any nutritional benefit out of it. So that's a big part that consumers can play as well. So this is kind of a lot of words on one slide, and I apologize for that. But here are the 5 main critical inputs and impacts we evaluated. So we mentioned some of these: land use. A third of U.S. land is dedicated to range and pasture, which is a lot. And you start to look at the different options you have in the grocery store. It's actually pretty surprising to figure out that conventional grain-fed beef might be your best option if you're really concerned about land use, because they just spend less time on pasture. They get moved to the confined feedlot and they spend 6 months less on pasture, which means less land, etc. Water, there's this distinction between blue water and green water. So green water being rainfall, blue water being unnaturally. And 90 to 90%, 95% of all blue water used for feed comes from feed. So irrigating our corn or irrigating our sorghum, and that's a lot of the water impact. So again, if you want to make less impact, go for grass-fed on rain-fed pasture, which we like from the Midwest, where we're not really irrigating our grassland as much as we are out in California. Labor, mentioned that a little bit as well. So a lot of people working in ranching and meatpacking. There's also the element of pesticide applicators as a huge environmental health risk for farmhands who are applying and mixing pesticides. So if that's really your main concern, looking towards organic, which really limits your pesticide use, and on-farm processing can get away from some of those not known labor concerns. This one's tough because meatpacking is just labor-intensive work. So we know it's bad at the big factories. It's probably also bad on farm, but this is that's less documented. So this is kind of a little bit of ignorance here of we don't know that it's quite as bad yet. And then emissions is a big part of this. So I'm sure you all heard about cow burps, cow farts. And one of the main takeaways that I would from that whole section up there is that, again, conventional grain-fed beef kind of comes out in front. And it's because of the way that production works. So if you go back to this, grass-fed beef never goes to the feedlot. And it actually takes longer for those grass-fed cows to reach slaughter weight, which means they're on this earth longer, emitting more methane. So significant, like months longer, which means that overall they are emitting more global warming potential emissions, which is pretty shocking. A lot of people will tell you that, like, you know, we have conventional grain-fed beef coming out as like potentially the best option in two of these major categories. And then farm economics was the last thing we wanted to look at to get that economic part of the sustainability triangle. And there's really mixed information here. The basic takeaway is that if you want to support the farmer most, buy directly from a farmer at a farmer's market where they're going to be able to keep the most amount of revenue. You do get organic and grass-fed price premiums, which can help a farmer, but oftentimes the input costs and certification costs kind of outweigh what's going on there. We got a few more slides here, but one of the other things we talk about is just like what's happening in the space. We framed this in terms of sticks and carrots quite a bit. So this is more on the industry, like government regulation, corporation level than the consumer. But sticks, you've got regulations. So the Clean Water Act, CAFOs have to get NIPD's permits to emit into waterways, which is a big thing. They can get sued for not doing that. And like I said, lawsuits. So a lot of citizen lawsuits against CAFOs and other. Tyson just got sued for their climate smart beef claim a couple year ago under some consumer protection acts. And then carbon agriculture taxes. This is something we found in Europe. That's quite cool. So Denmark's got a program where all like livestock, they get taxed on 60% of the emissions of livestock. So if they can bring down 40% of their emissions, they don't get taxed at all. I might have said that wrong, but essentially if they can reduce 40% of their emissions, they don't get taxed at all. And if they don't, they'll get taxed on that top 40%. So it's gonna bring down the livestock emission quite a bit, which is pretty innovative. It's pretty cool. And then carrots, like I said, price premium certifications say something to a consumer as well. So that's a benefit. And then USDA has programs, a little bit less so now, more so in the past, that grants and technical assistance to people who are trying to do climate smart, environmentally friendly things like grass-fed, organic, etc. So, and the last thing, I kind of alluded to this, but this is really the way that we've tried to frame this. It's really precarious to try to declare a most sustainable type of beef. And really, if you're looking for most sustainable, it's don't eat it. But the right sustainability decision really depends upon your goals from person to person. So like I said, if you really care about limiting deforestation, if that's your big issue, domestic conventional beef, again, might be your best option. The Tyson package at the farm at Kroger might be your best choice. Same thing with climate impacts. Water use, go get some grass-fed Midwest beef because they're not irrigating that corn crop as much. So there's an infinite list of things that people could care about here. But this is kind of where we ended up as our main list of goals that people could have. I think that might be the last slide. But yeah, so that's an overview of what we've tried to do. I'm happy to, if you have any questions, answer any about the information or the process of trying to find this information.
Natasha, should we do chicken or should we stop talk about talk about his experience learning this? How do you like to?
To you, it seems like if we have a discussion with the same kind of premise on like, what are your concerns, they'll be a little bit similar.
Yeah.
So maybe if we.
I think we do chicken and then we can kind of step back and they can both think about,
So good job.
yeah. It's a PDF, so yeah. And then good, yep, top arrow thing, perfect. There you go. Right. Same idea, different carcass type.
Hey guys, I'm sorry about that. Hey guys, my name is William Lee, but then like Wang, you can call me Wang, you guys want to. But like just a little background information about my project. I also have like two other teammates that was helping me doing this kind of research. And at first, for the scope, we only wanted to focus on the US domestically. But then the more we try to dig into the market, we find out that the problem actually like go a lot deeper. So we actually expand into international wise. Yeah, and as my friend already mentioned, when you walk into the supermarket, there are so many different labels and different kind of packaging you can pick on on the chicken. You have like conventional chicken, organic chicken, free range raised, non-cage, so many different like products out there. But then the one thing important that you have to notice is that the chicken industry is mostly running on something called vertically integrated system. So like because like the chicken industry, like they raise like a lot of chicken within one farm, right? And then like the only people that are able to like afford to buy all those chicken are like large corporation. And then like if they don't, and then like so like they will lose like a lot of chicken from that. So the way they raise, so like mostly of like the chicken lifestyle product is a lot of them are like controlled by like the bigger corporation. And from like from like feeding chicken, farming the chicken, processing.
We can use the arrows here.
Right, and some fun facts: chickens actually like accounted annually. Like the average US actually consume 100 pounds of chicken annually, which is like a lot, almost as much as beef. And something surprisingly, when I did this research, was that like 60 and 70% of like the total cost and environmental impact is actually coming from the feed of the chicken. Like what is it feeding the chicken? And then like there's surprisingly very limited research on that. And yeah, we really try to like go into like cradle to grave with like the products, but then like I would want to point out mostly about like fit and production, like fit and inputs, and also as like customer action, like what can you do about it? So right, so like the biggest thing we found out when doing this research was that the heat and ocean impacts of like between like the soy industry and like the chicken industry. So like chicken are mostly fed by corn and soil. Corn and soy, and then right. But then like how do I say it? Like from like there's like very limited studies on like the direct relationship between soy and chicken, but nonetheless, like sorry sorry yeah right and yeah, as you can look at at the graph, right? Even though like there is like very limited study on like the different like the direct relationship between the soy industry and the chicken industry, but then like the land use of the land like there's always land lost in like the Brazil rainforest to clear out for raising the soy industry. So like that's like the correlation, even though like there's very limited study on that. And furthermore, like the chicken diet is consists of like 60% to the soy too. So like what the word for it? Like there will be always be like the demand for like soy correlation with like the chicken industry. And like in like the Brazil rainforest right now, there's something called like the displacement effects. Just pretty much like fortunate investment coming into like the rainforest to like the smaller farm and like smaller rancher, and then like they offer like a lot of money for like those cattle farm to turn into like soybean farm. So as like a small farmer in Brazil, it's like little to no reason for you to like not take that offer. So you end up like selling your land to like bigger corporations so they can like raise soybean farm in there. And what do you do as a farmer? You will go to like another place, still in like the rainforest, but like with cheaper prices. And then like you will like cut down the tree to like raise your like cattle again, and then like big corporation coming in again. So like that's like the cycle we're seeing here. Like the relationship I'm trying to like the leadership that our team found in like the life cycle. And sorry. And yes, in from 2013 to 2020, 6 million hectare of like natural ecosystem loss was like there was like 6 million hectare lost in like the Brazil ecosystem, rainforest ecosystem, which is to put in comparison, it was about the size of like West Virginia. So yeah, like it's a big loss. And another critical inputs and output our team found was that like in the study is that like the chicken itself responsible for like 80 to 85% of the total operation cost in the chicken industry. As a result, for like some other for us for like sustainable people to like come in and tell like, hey, we want to we want you to change the way you are raising chicken. It can be like very difficult because like the chicken itself is already like 80% of like the operational cost. So which I believe can also like create incentive for like farm and industry to kind of go around so labeling kind of thing, because like when we talk about like labels, we have like organic, free range, cage free, but then like what does it really mean to be organics, right? Like you can like raise chicken, you can put like antibiotic into a chicken, wait for like 2 years, and then like release them to like the market again, and then you can call it organics. Or like cage free, you can like put it into like, like this, like you can still put it into like a living area, but then like it can still be like very compacted like a chicken. So like you really have to like dig deep into like this kind of thing to really know what's going on. There's like a big price incentive for it. And yeah, and this is one thing I would recommend when you like buying the chicken is definitely looking for the government label, like such as like the USDA organic label, because like we're doing like we're doing like really good job on that. Uh, Antibiotic regulation in America actually reduced antibiotic use from 90% to less than 1% from 2013 to 2024. And they will come in and then like, test your products. If you fail your test, and then like you have like even like more oversight that you have to do. And like when they are conducting that oversight, you can't really sell your products. So so like you still have to keep things running, so operation costs will be even higher. So like it's like a very heavy sick regulation you are having. And then like in some cases there will even be like products recall. A food product recall can cost you at least $10 million per recall. So like definitely a big hit if that happened. And carrots, definitely one of the most important thing is price incentive. Some people are willing to pay like a 125% premium just for like the organic label, and 50% for like the non-antibiotics. Furthermore, the government, they are also even providing more incentive for farmers to do so, such that they will pay 75% of the price of a certification for the farmer. And like if the farmer complete that certification, they will give like another $750. So it's like a win-win scenario that I don't think anyone will pass out on. And lastly, it's definitely like our corporation and McDonald's. Recently, in 2020, they have like a strict no antibiotic rules for like the sourcing. So like they will only take like no antibiotic chicken from like farm and ranches. The result is definitely drive like farm to like raise the chicken in that way, so they can have like big contract with McDonald's and like also big food company. And yeah, the main takeaways from here is 60% to 70% of the life cycle impacts is from the feed production itself, and it can create some like upstream dilemmas in like the operational cost of like mainly from like the chicken itself. And soy expansion is directly linked with like the high demand for chicken, because like there will always be like high demand for chicken, and like as demand going up, soy demand also going up, which lead to even like more forest being deforested. Yeah. And now ask us what consumer, what can we do about it? So I would say that the main thing we can do right now is looking for like a government label, like organic label that was like oversight by the government, because like government, they definitely like have like a less incentive to make a profit out of us. And as a consumer, we can also choose to like not buy from like all the labels that we feel like sketchy, that we feel like it's more information about that. Because like even like as little as it seems, like our action, like we deciding not to like buy from them, actually drive their operation. Because like we actually, just like by the example of like McDonald's, our action actually like, force them to only like sourcing like no antibiotic chicken ever. So like that's a good sign. Thank you.
Yeah, questions? Thoughts?
Were the two together?
Yeah, I think so. So,
You go.
I have a question about, okay, this isn't directly related to your project, so you can just tell me I don't want to answer that, and that's fine. But I was, when you were talking just now about how there's like this bottom-up consumer impact on how these things are navigated and what kinds of antibiotics are going into things, I was curious about your thoughts about like top-down influence on people's perceived hierarchies, and if there's competition in like the current political environment for like what we're prioritizing when it comes to, but like particularly protein consumption, and this like kind of something adjacent to like an inversion of our historical food pyramid. And if you think that certain kinds of labels that are like, I just see it all the time, like even Starbucks is like, oh, this is a high protein coffee drink or whatever, like things you don't probably need to have lots of protein inserted into. If these sorts of new fixations and inputs are going to impact the way that you're thinking about consumer sustainability, I suspect it will impact consumers themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I can take it first. So, I mean, you mentioned the inverted food pyramid. So, what is his RFK's role? Secretary of HHS. His like make America healthy again thing. It definitely has an impact on this. I would say that I'm a little bit more cynical about consumer action than the average person in fields like this. Which has been somewhere that I've grown throughout college. So I actually would have probably come in saying that like consumers we can change, we can solve climate change ourselves. And I actually heard Michael Oppenheimer come when he was here for a patent lecture. I asked him a question about that and he was like very staunchly like, it doesn't matter what you do as a consumer. And then like the more I looked into that, I was like, I mean, I don't want to like take all autonomy out of the consumer, but so that when we see things like the inverted food pyramid and bringing like beef back into our messaging of the American economy, it's frustrating to me because that's what I think that's where it has to come from in terms of you have to give incentives. I mean, you can't just leave behind the farmers who are doing all this work because you said it was 1.5 million people. But I think the ability for consumers to do anything other than just eat less of it. Well, I don't know if that really answered your question, but Jason.
Yeah, I mean like I have like a similar point of view because like how do I say it? Like I did not have like a lot of background information about this kind of thing before I come into this class. And then like the more I look into it, the more I'm like, what can I really do about this? Right? And then like but like I guess the one thing we can do is just try it. Like never like I mean like this we can't just give up before trying. Right.
couple of thoughts on that. I agree, and I think too much has been pushed on to consumers to be like, you know, if you just bought organic, we wouldn't have climate change. Sort of like, okay, well, that's not actually in any way accurate. But then looking at what happens when McDonald's changes their requirements for antibiotic use. I mean, like, do those social media campaigns actually do something? Like, because that's huge. And you think of everybody that either sells to or wants to be able to sell to McDonald's, and they now need to match that baseline. And that's a huge thing, which is it's not consumer driven in the sense of like, what can I do as an individual consumer, but it's not due to government demand or top down, which I think is really interesting. One other thought about that, given how quickly things can change, just in the political climate and culturally, whatever. This is as of 2026 is what it looks like. I could see, especially the way that the world's changing now, every few years, we're like, all right, let's update beef because things are different now. And a lot of that is with the regulations and the policy, but also just things like diet and land use change. And, fertilizer is getting really expensive and might see some big changes. And it might be that fertilizer use in corn is going to be relatively, I don't know. It's still going to be really high. But
I'll just add one more thing to that too. Like we mentioned that the top dollar inverted food pyramid could have some problematic messaging, but we also see that like the rates of people going, especially young people being vegan and vegetarian, probably going to outpace whatever comes from that. So like that is significantly on the rise. So I don't know if that's consumer action so much in the sense of like changing the industry, but more of like just choosing to withhold yourself from the industry. So I think that will balance out.
And there's some interplays there too. I mean, you hear a lot of like the people that are all red meat are often like also talk. I mean, I heard Joe Rogan, Russell Crowe talking about regenerative agriculture as part of a like everybody should eat red meat, but it should look like this. It should be U.S. grass fed and all the rest. So these sort of conversations are coming up even in those sort of places, which is I think interesting and part of this very rapidly changing landscape.
It's a really interesting way of thinking about top down that I hadn't thought about with Joe Rogan.
Yeah. Thank you. I learned a lot. This was really cool. Thank you so much, both in both presentations. So are you publishing a report or something on it? And I'll tell you why, because this would be great material for a class that I teach, Sustainability and Society 101, about the difficulties of consumer choice, right? There's no perfect choice, and so it would be great material for a class like that if you produce it.
We're hoping to. So these are still works in progress, and any input or discussion here might go into the final product. There will be a final report in 2 weeks, due in 2 weeks into the semester. McKinsey and I will then pick it up. And I think there's 7 now, and there's potentially an 8th if I can track down the person who should be writing it outside of this class. We'll pick it up, and the goal is to have a series of nice glossy PDF for a consumer who's ready to spend 6 or 8 pages, in the 20 minutes to do it. So hopefully, but I said that a year ago, and
Because I would use I use now an exercise that my colleague Sarah Osterhout developed, which is called the most sustainable strawberry ? Right. And so it kinds of goes through the same trade-offs that you guys did really well there. I have a question about the role of transportation in beef.
Yeah.
Because I mean, all things considered equal, if it is produced closer or farther, or importing from Brazil or so forth. So I wonder if you could talk about transportation.
I'm trying to remember, I want to say that transportation accounted for less than 10% of all the beef industry's emissions, which was surprising to me as well. So like so much of it is coming from the methane. So 10% is not, that's directionally accurate. It might be able to give some error there. But that's also still a lot considering how much the beef industry, like gross emissions, the beef industry is responsible for. So that is a way that consumers can have some impact. So if you buy from a farm that you can see across the street, obviously that's not going to have a lot of transportation emissions. But you also need to be careful, because if they're not processing in-house, then they could have sent that to California to get processed and come back to you, and it's not exactly what you thought it was. But it does definitely come into play when we talk about Argentinian tariff relief with all that beef that's been happening. That will have higher emissions, but I would venture to guess that the higher emissions from that is actually more from land use change of that beef than it being transported here. There's also some elements of there's a cold supply chain with beef, so there's refrigerants involved, which we've gotten a lot better at handling, those ozone depleting chemicals. But that's also, if those get out, that's even worse than methane in a lot of instances. So you have to, if you can limit cross-country travel or international travel, you're definitely doing something, especially considering just the sheer amount of emissions coming from this whole process.
Yeah. And there is a tendency to focus on the thing that we understand and can track, like transportation. And you're like, I'm going to focus on this 10% and ignore the 90%.
Yeah.
There was a study that came out, I think Our World and Data picked it up, but it came out from somewhere else, looking at transportation and greenhouse gas emissions and food. And across the board, it's far less than people think. Also weird things, being like, is it going by truck? Is it going by train? Is it going by, cargo ship? I remember I saw a study, oranges in California, it was better to get them from Chile than from Florida, because it's coming by a freighter versus a truck, which is kind of counterintuitive. And so some of the proxies look for, like miles, proximity, could be less indicative, especially when you work in the processing fee or processing stage.
I have one more question. But on the chicken as well, but just one thing that is very controversial in Brazil, I don't know if you know about this, is you sell livestock and you transport the entire herd, especially to the Middle East.
The Middle East.
Yeah, it's live and it'll be slaughtered there.
Is that a halal thing?
Yeah. And it's very controversial, of course, because you're aggregating the value, elsewhere instead of trading it here. So, but that's just a particularity of Brazil. On the, just one comment on the spillover of deforestation, which I think you capture very well. There's another spillover that is not captured in that deforestation, which is that, like when the soybean moratorium and the clean supply chain start pressuring, the deforestation increase in the savanna region. Which is not counted in the same deforestation of the forest, tropical forest region, but is even bigger. And is equally a very large deforestation. It's just not a charismatic kind of situation. But the spillover is actually much bigger because it goes to the savanna, the central Cerrado of Brazil.
Cerrado, that's it.
I did not know that.
So that's one thing. But you had a point there, I guess that's prioritize products that address beef stage impacts. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like what kinds of products or how do we see the product that address impact?
Yeah.
Good luck, I'll let you.
I mean, like, as I already mentioned, right now, because like I'm also very skeptical with like label from like third parties. So I would focus on like the governmental labels that was like actually like oversight from the government, because like as I mentioned, there's like the company have like a lot of incentive, like a lot of profit to make when it comes to like this kind of like label, right? So like what other like agencies that have like less incentive to make profit out of us, the government. So like right, at least for now, until like further research being made, I would say that you find like government labels such as like USDA organic chicken, right? Something like that. Or you can like you really want to, you can really dig into like the labeling that the company have and then like to see if they are really telling you the truth or not.
I have a follow-up question that I think we'll get into this too. Are there chickens that don't eat corn? Like, can you?
And you have a
breastfeed-
soy-free chicken.
Like, I don't.
I mean like it can be like a very skinny chicken.
Like, I mean, you can get a really healthy cow breastfeeding, or corn feeding. Like,
Well, and you do see pastured poultry, and I don't know if that's now a label that's on the product, but potentially that is one that could be like, it's more the diet comes from the pasture. One thing I've pushed students, and this is hard to do, and they've pushed back, but we're working on it, to say, what can you do with the information now? What information is available that consumers don't have access to, such as like what percent of this chicken's diet was soy versus something else? And what information do we not have, but we could have that could potentially get to consumers? So trying to think like, I think I've used the chocolate example with the class, being like, it wasn't that long ago, you get a Hershey's bar, you get like a Mars bar, and that's it. And now there's as much going on as you want. You can find the farm, you can go and talk to the person that picked the cacao if you are willing. And so to what extent might these markets, because they're in such flux, be able to adapt? And ideally, informing consumers will lead to better demand for better information, and we can kind of, it'll move in that direction. But yeah, it's something like, is cage free that important? Or if it's all about the diet, can I please get a label about the diet? Please, go ahead.
I wonder if there are any, if you saw or came across any lessons from the sustainable fisheries, which has a long history too. But just wonder if you sort of, saw examples or lessons from there.
I'm sorry, sustainable what? Fisheries.
Fisheries.
Yeah, it's not something we brought up in the class. It worked out that this class, that the 7 projects we had, we were all about food and drink. That was kind of just convenient. So, and then within the food and drink, these were the 2 protein ones. So no, we didn't look at it. I think it's interesting, and there are a lot of like that's where the sustainability scorecard started. Was the aquarium I used to live right next to. Yes, thank you. And it's a different, it's a much less managed system. You're not aquaculture would be very similar, but a lot of those have to do with like the aquatic ecosystem the fish are in, the life cycle, the kind of diet of the fish, and things where it's like, all right, you're comparing sea bass here versus tuna here versus salmon here and halibut there. There's, I think, less you can do as humans, whereas here, there's so much variability in how you raise a beef cow, and you can do it in your backyard, or you can do it in Argentina and have them send up the pieces. So no, we didn't look into that. I haven't thought a lot about it. I think that would be, we could have a class focused on sustainable protein. I think that'd be.
We have a sustainable fisheries class. I don't need.
Do we?
Okay.
I mean, like when you say kind of like sustainable fishery, right? That's kind of like a common resource kind of problem. So no. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's
Right. So like I guess we can do something when it's come to like smaller scale, right? Because like we in like the Ostrom workshop, we can use like the Ostrom finding on that.
But we're thinking that when you buy salmon, is very blurred. The raised salmon, right? I mean, the labels are not super clear.
The joke is that they consume more wild Alaskan salmon in New York City than they catch in Alaska.
Yeah.
So, and we import more organic vegetables from Mexico than they export to us, but yeah.
Amazing projects, really.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about like CAFOs, like, is there, I mean, there's the land benefit, but do the other negative externalities outweigh like wanting to do that? There's profit incentive, obviously, but local water supplies, the, pollution that it generates, and also the fact that it's like not super popular in local communities. Is there a benefit? Oh, I didn't mention disease also as well, risking the entire flock, right? So did you see, was there any benefit aside from just like profit incentive?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the conventional grain feds like that CAFO system, I don't have it up, but like that, it is lower emission, it is lower water usage, or it was lower on another one too. So there are some environmental benefits. Unfortunately, we did have to like scope out some like nutrient pollution wasn't a focus here, but like a major thing that comes out of CAFOs. The benefit with CAFOs is that they are getting to be pretty highly regulated because they're so unpopular. There's been a lot of pushes to like they do have to get clean water. They can get sued and fined if they're distributing too much effluent into the local waterway. It's not a perfect system, but I think environmental media has done a really good job of putting CAFOs in the crosshair, and it has worked in some regards. But that's one of the counterintuitive things of this is that like if you were going for total climate impacts and that was really your main goal, CAFOs might be your best option, which also kind of begs the question of should we should have probably a broader idea of sustainability than just climate change, because clearly that's not the best option for everything considered, for the workers who have to be in there, for the ozone chemicals that are coming out of it, the everything like that clearly can't be the right answer, even though the science says right now it in some ways is.
I do want to be careful with the clearly it can't, because a CAFO that's like they used to just dump it in the river and sorry about your Lake Erie, versus one that's like capturing all of that nutrient pollution, capping it and making biogas from it. Like
that's really
and the variability, I think one thing that I've really come to appreciate from this sort of from watching y'all do this is like it depends so much on some of the nuances of like with regulation, you can concentrate all that pollution in one place where you can take care of it versus spreading it around where you can't.
I'll revise myself. Clearly 20th century CAFOs.
Yes.
So we gotta move forward.
I do think it's interesting, and you had the point about the efficiency of cows and then getting them in, of corn and then getting them to market, rather than like the longer the cow's on the planet, the more it's gonna belch and fart and emit methane that way. And so that's it's counterintuitive, but I think our intuitions on sustainability as consumers are really off. And they're guided by like labels with flowers on them and organic certification and these things where it's like, well, clearly it's bad. It's like, when you do the numbers, it's actually not so clear. And so, what are the levers you can pull? And sometimes they're counterintuitive. It's like, it's really bad unless we did this and then it'd be much better, which is an interesting kind of nuance sort of takeaway.
Hope that answers the question.
Please.
I had another question maybe about like CAFOs for beef. If there was any attempts at like methane capture.
Yeah, so he mentioned that methane capture, I don't, there are a lot of people that are trying to do biogas into electricity, so they're capturing everything that really comes out, burning it.
Yep.
Electricity to, run the thing. In one of the classes with actually Jesse O'Reilly, we read an IPCC report on land and food security, and one of the things that struck me in there is like we have vaccines we can give to cows to reduce their methane emissions. We can improve the digestibility of feed to reduce so there are some like scientific innovation levers we can pull, because as far as I understand it, I'm not an animal scientist, but like enteric fermentation is basically incomplete like combustion within the animal. So if we can make the feed more efficient, and that often comes through GMOs, unfortunately, that's altering the feed we grow, but like that's another way you can do it. We can give vaccine to a cow that's gonna help it have a better biological system. I don't know what state of the art those are in. Like, I don't know if those are ready to be scaled up and happen, but the IPCC is talking about them as legitimate. Methane's tough.
Also, you have methane coming out of the manure lagoons.
Yeah.
And then you have methane coming out of the cow itself.
Yeah.
One is easier to cap than the other.
Yeah.
In terms of stopping it at the source. But yes.
Thank you. Nice presentation. I think that these are the topics that we can discuss always, because it's part of our daily life, what we eat. I was wondering about these consumer actions and how you see these the decisions of the consumer, but how you add to this discussion the price and the income, because when we really think what we are gonna eat, so it is based on this rational decision of, okay, the price. So, but if we wanna buy things like organic or with all these sustainability issues, so.
And I like
this inequality, so we cannot afford.
And if we can afford, many people can. And what's the value there? I do like that sustainability, going back to how things have changed in 20 years, that sustainability at least should have an explicit economic consideration. I think a lot of the kind of environmental, dietary sort of stuff was like, everybody should do the best thing. It doesn't matter how expensive it is. And it's like, all right, well, economics say that there are some pros and cons. And if everybody's paying more for food, people who can't afford to pay that are having less food. And so some of these interconnections and the trade-offs, I like stopping at okay, here's the trade-offs, just so you understand them. You pick what you want, and not trying to go to like, and therefore everyone should. Largely because of these sort of trade-offs, is that if everybody has to do something expensive, some people aren't gonna be able to do it, and what happens then? I don't know if that answers your question, but the integration of things like price and quantity produced and the accessibility into sustainability considerations, it feels relatively new to me. I think it was often just ignored. Like, everybody should be organic. I'm like, okay, well, that's half the world that can't be fed.
Yeah.
So just.
I think one of the nice things, especially about beef, maybe a little bit less so about chicken, is that you do have the option of just not eat it and having other cheaper, like if you cut out beef, you can turn to chicken, which has a smaller footprint and is cheaper. So like that is kind of helps get around some of the inequality. Like if you're really concerned about, I don't want to buy organic beef, buy less beef. And that's a way to both save you money and have a better input.
There is something funny. I was thinking, if chickens are mostly fed soy and people switch from chicken to tofu, there's some kind of ironies there. It's like, do you eat the soy in tofu form or in chicken form? But other considerations